Well, welcome everyone to our third seminar this year in the series under the rubric of our new project, Reimagining Contemporary Ministries for a Renewing Church. And as I think we'll see today, both of those will come into play, both contemporary ministries and a way of reimagining those for specifically a renewing church. And I'm really excited about the panel that we brought together today because in very many ways, these are the people I like to listen to, right? When I talk to these people, they both confirm the very best instincts in my own heart and mind when it comes to Christian faith and ministry, but also they challenge me in the work that they're doing and the words that they use. And so I'm really excited to share some of what I've learned, from them with you all today. I want to start, not taking too much time here, and we'll try to be pretty efficient in our use of time, but maybe framing a little bit what we mean when we talk about the neighborhood as the parish, engaging the local community, because in some ways we can just sort of think of this as another exercise in doing what we've always done, which is kind of going out into the world and bringing people in, right? As though maybe we're just talking about new challenges and new opportunities for doing that sort of thing. But as I'm 100% sure you'll hear today from our panelists, that's not what we're talking about. And I wanted to start maybe just by reading from one of the authors who's having a big impact on me these days. It's Sam Wells. He's a pastor, theologian, ethicist. He's the rector of St. Martin in the Fields Church just off of Trafalgar Square in London. And recently he was reflecting, during the pandemic about the way that the current crisis that society was going through, the church was going through, has been a bit of a refiner's fire. And so when he talks here about before COVID and after COVID, or in the late stages of COVID, I'm thinking this has wider implications for the Christendom church and the post-Christendom church that we're trying to navigate these days. So I want to read a little bit to you, and maybe it'll help to frame some of our discussion here today. So Sam writes, "After COVID, I see a humbler church, but a bigger God. I want to explain what I mean by that." And he then goes on to quote here from the French philosopher Michel de Certeau, who was actually a Jesuit himself, and someone who's coming to greater prominence now as his works, which were written in a pretty impenetrable French, are being translated into other languages. So the French philosopher and theologian Michel de Certeau distinguishes between a strategy and a tactic. Okay? A strategy builds a citadel, and from its control base makes forays into the hinterland, whereas a tactic has no home base, nowhere to store its booty, and survives by hand-to-hand encounters on the ground. I want to put these contrasting concepts to use with a broad distinction. So here are two familiar statements, he says. "Make me a channel of your peace," says the 1967 hymn based on a prayer written in France in 1912, widely, though mistakenly, attributed to St. Francis. It says this: "Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours." So says the 16th century Spanish mystic Teresa of Avila. I want to highlight what these two sentiments have in common. They assume what I want to call a strategy church. A strategy church makes two assumptions that I think are relevant to our discussion of the church today. The first is an unspoken sense that Jesus ascended before he'd actually finished his work. And therefore it falls to us, his beloved and chosen followers, to complete the work he was too busy or too distracted to attend to. The second is that if one imagines an hourglass, with the top and much larger part being heaven, and the bottom and smaller part being earthly existence, and Jesus being the aperture through which the angels ascend and descend between the two, then we, or more precisely the church, currently constitute the aperture. The church is the principal and definitive way in which God continues to work in the world after the manner of Christ's incarnation. Now let me contrast this picture with what I'm going to call tactic church. Christ plays in 10,000 places, says the Jesuit Gerard Manley Hopkins, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his. Notice how this tactic language differs from the assumptions of a strategy church. In this version, the church doesn't have to be the source from which all blessings flow. A colleague told me about 3 women who attended a church before COVID. the church had to shut for a few weeks for repairs. So the three women made a plan. One went to car boot sales each Sunday morning, met and talked with the regulars, formed relationships, and learned much. Another went to Sunday league football games and had a similar experience. A third went to IKEA and got to know staff and customers. After a few weeks, the three women compared notes and had enough information to become excited about what they were discovering and understanding. When the time came that church reopened after the refit, they had a genuine quandary about whether to return or whether to continue in their explorations. One of them explained, "Our God is now too big to fit back into our church." What they were naming was their discovery of tactic church. Tactic church does not assume everything God is doing comes through the church. It doesn't assume the best example of God's ways is always the church. It rejoices to discover the surprises of what the Spirit is doing in unexpected places through unheralded people. Tactic church entails a humbler church, but apprehends a bigger God. What I'm describing, Sam concludes here, imitates the transformation described in 2nd Isaiah. In exile, beleaguered and bereft, Israel learned that its God was a much bigger God, the God of the whole world. But it also learned that God was more than happy to use agents other than itself, such as Cyrus, who didn't even claim to know Israel's God. That's the discovery we now need to recall. I wanted to just read you that to kind of frame our discussion today. Strategy Church, Christendom Church, is a church of gatekeeping, right? It's we have something that the world needs, and by golly, we're going to find some way of doing that, through some new mission, some new ministry, some new program. Tactic church is about recognizing the Holy Spirit is already at work in this world. God's work is ongoing, whether we're cooperating with it or not. But why not get out there and get cooperating? And the people we brought together today, I think, are going to speak about that kind of work. And so, without further ado, and we'll proceed alphabetically here, I think, for no other imaginative reason. We'll start with Reverend Molly Finlay and Reverend Johan Dumpala speaking about work at St. John's, Norway.
That's the name of the church right there. Thank you so much, Father Jeffrey, and nice to be here. Thank you for having me and our wonderful curate Johan, who has embarked on this great adventure with our beloved community at the corner of Woodbine and Kingston Roads, just east of downtown Toronto. I came to the parish in the middle of the big lockdown. I mean, I don't know, the second lockdown 2, I can't keep track of them all now. I think we kind of seem to be buried in my subconscious at this point, but Advent 1, I arrived in the parish in 2020. And we had a bit of a beleaguered, how I would describe my community at that time, was a bit of a beleaguered group. They had been through some difficult clergy transitions. I think it's safe to say their previous rector had left just a week after the pandemic started. So they had their existing curate and they had a priest in charge, both of whom were wonderful. But they were in a bit of shell shock. And they were a small band of faithful disciples. So when I arrived, my first job, I had a few things that we wanted to do together. And first was to keep the community connected. They were on a conference call, which was working for some, but not for everyone. And so we moved everyone onto Zoom, allowing for people who could only access a telephone to still dial in. And then, but for folks who did have the capacity to be on a computer, they could see each other. And we started a pre-recorded online service. All of this stuff, many of our parishes have done a variety of these different things. And then we began to build a new ministry team. I had a wonderful curate who was finishing up his curacy, and so he departed, and I was very blessed to have a summer student. The administrator retired when I first got there, so it was like a brand new thing. Johan arrived 6 months after as our youth minister, and that was great, and I was very fortunate to be able to hire a new parish administrator. It really helped us with creating virtual bulletins and helped us communicate more easily with the rest of the congregation, who, of course, like many of our parishes, was dispersed. And then we decided that we were going to begin meeting together in virtual ways to study the scriptures and to get us talking about our faith together and deepening our lives as disciples. So we started doing that. That was the next thing that we embarked on. And COVID was a blessing in some ways, because it allowed, and I also had a director of music change as well, even just when I arrived, which was significant. The pandemic actually allowed us to renew our liturgical lives. We were able to try new things and just kind of get out of a rote pattern of praying into something that was a little more life-giving to all of us. So these were the things that we did probably in the first year. Now, my thinking was, and I could be wrong about all of this. Like, I don't have the answers here. We're all in different contexts, but my thinking was, I need to get our community together virtually through phone calls for folks who didn't have access to a computer, for example. That was important, making sure that everybody had a connection back to one another. And to get us together and to give us a sense of hope in the midst of this really bleak time. And, as I say, building a new ministry team and then working on some of the liturgical aspects of our life together. It was only after we were able to do these things that we started to really investigate the neighborhood around us. And I'm sure all of you have experienced lockdown church, but for folks like me who came into a community in the middle of lockdown, doing these things was really important. We started to do a lot of things in our parking lot, and we would invite, it's not all these pictures are in our parking lot, but we, for example, Christmas time, we got the nativity animals into our parking lot, and we would just be a presence to people, and everybody was invited. We started having outdoor parties as soon as we were allowed to provide food and drink by the diocese. And we would always make sure that we were able just to provide tons of food. Like we'd buy 200 burgers when we figured there'd only be 75 people eating. And we just made sure that everybody knew that we were having this event. Johan and I walked around and invited people in the side streets to come, and we weren't embarrassed. We were like, come and see, just come and have a burger, have a free lunch, it'd be great to have you. And we had a lot of people who came into the parking lot who'd never been inside the church. One person told Johan, few people told you, Johan, that they thought our church was a chapel for the cemetery. Like it was only good for dead people, I don't know what that has to say about the life of the community, but anyway, that was not the state, the nation for sure for the parish. But we just had wonderful conversations with people as they came in, and the nativity animals were the first sort of foray that we did that first Christmas. We continued on every Christmas since, which has only been, I guess this will be my third Christmas with them, so we're planning on doing it again. And then when we were able to, these are more recent photographs of parties that we've had in our basement in the colder weather. But listen, this isn't really anything new. I just think we tried to offer hospitality, and just invite people to come and see. So I think we can move forward. These are just photographs. The other thing that we did was, and I was sharing with Maggie about this earlier, that I just asked the parish in Lent, the first Lent that I was there, I said, folks on Zoom, right? We were all on Zoom on the phone, people dialing in and on Zoom. I said, it would be great if I could just get a couple bags of groceries and a few gift cards just so that when someone comes to our doors during the week and, you know, needs some help, we have something to give them. Like, we can't turn people away with nothing. So I am not exaggerating when I say this, what you see here on these slides, this is what showed up for us during Lent. And I think there was one Saturday during Lent before Holy Week that we had the drop-off day. We just said, just bring a few gift cards in and some groceries. And it was truly like the loaves and fishes. From our little community came an abundance of God's generosity, right? And so then we basically had like a table about this size full of food, and I had stacks of these gift cards. So I said, well, I think we should just open up our cupboard and set up a little thing and open the church doors on Monday morning, and let's, you know, put a sign out and say, if you're hungry, you need something to eat, we've got something here. And that's how our little basic food pantry was born. This is not a big deal. I am sure my beloved colleagues are doing way more exciting stuff than we are, but this was a little thing we could do. Until we did this, they were doing the ACW, the church women, who are wonderful knitters, would do knitting, and they'd write a check, right? That was their idea. But my sense was, you know, in my experience, being with the poor is part of our calling. Listening to folks who have a different experience from some of us, for example. And so this was a way in which our people were able to be a listening ear to folks, get to know people who are in the community and what their struggles are. And now we have over 20 people coming on any given Monday. And there are relationships that have been formed by our lay folk with these visitors. It's completely run by the laity. Johan and I are not involved in running this, and people love to serve in this way. And it gives me great joy in seeing a church that was, you know, closed up tight, doors locked for, you know, years and years. It gives me a great joy to see people, you know, coming through our doors who've never been inside before, and to know that they are full citizens and they belong. And a lot of times they'll say, oh, I'd like to see the inside of the church. And then, you know, they go in, take a look around, they can have some quiet time in there if they want, which, let's face it, is a scarce commodity in our world today. So that's one thing that got started, and I'm gonna take 2 last minutes. So this is just an example of our parking lot, and we had some all ages kind of events, and that's just a blessing of the animals thing that, I don't know, we just threw that in because it's a horse. But everybody does these. This is not rocket science. We are not reinventing the wheel, but we did love welcoming people from the neighborhood into our parking lot, and we've seen a lot of new people now coming to church. A lot of them have found our newcomers often have found their way into the community via our live stream during the lockdown. That was a big thing. But now I think more and more people feel that they actually are welcome through the front doors of this historic parish. And on that note, Johan is going to share with you what we're working on now is looking at how we can find out more about who our neighbor is within our parish boundaries.
So once I started my curacy, during one of our weekly meetings, we started kind of talking about trying to understand. I was new to the area as well. I live up in North York, and Molly is also is understanding the community. And now that we were back in person, and we're just interested to know who lives around us. And we reached out to Janet Marshall, who does congregational development in the diocese, and Bishop Kevin's office, and we got the green light to spend some money on an analytics program. And Environics was the one that we reached out to, and it took about a month for them to get back to us with all the data. So the sources that they looked at are Demostats 2022, which is a very basic demographic report, and Prism and Social Values are more psychographic in nature to give us an understanding of how people think in our parish area. And the last one doesn't quite help us, but it was kind of, it helps to give us an understanding as to spending patterns and if we ever need it. And the next slide. So this is our parish area. East is Coxwell Avenue, west Main Street, north Gerrard Street, and south is all the way down to Beaches Park. And we've got 25,000 people in our area and 11,000 households. The next slide. And just the report itself is about 32 pages long. So this is just key data that really is helping us kind of try to figure out what's next for our parish community and what do we have to start planning around. So in terms of the languages, 92% of people speak English, 21% are visible minorities, 28% are unemployed or retired, and married is 55%. Single, now this number was interesting for us. The single population, which is 29.18%, that helps us understand as we're trying to figure out a second service or an evening service on a Sunday, and how we can reach out to these folks, especially when winter comes around and everyone's homebound. Yet again, of course now it's no longer COVID, but it's the weather. And these are kind of the people that are also just stuck at home and may not have much to do on a Sunday night. And we have 14% who are separated, divorced, and widowed. And just a bit more data, but one that jumped out for me specifically was the number of Anglicans that are in our parish area, which is 2,000 of them. Of course, not all 2,000 come to our church, but it's a number that gives us an idea of the potential that's out there. Whether it's the de-churched or unchurched or just people who relate to the Anglican faith because of their parents or grandparents, but it's a potential for us to reach out to this community in our parish area. So there are two segments that really jumped out at us as Downtown Verve and Indieville. Now there are two sheets that kind of gives us a bit of an explanation as to who these people are, and Father Jeffrey, if you could scroll down to what they think or how they think. And this gives us an idea. So this is the 61.78% of the people in our parish area who kind of fall into this category. Those who are very independent, those who are family oriented, but they're also, there's another sheet as well that explains that there are also workaholics, which also helps us in the sense of giving them something on a Sunday night that might take them away from all the things that are keeping them busy during the week. But this is just some information, and of course it's a 32-page document, but if you ever get a chance to do something in your own parishes, it's a worthwhile report, and it really, really opens your eyes to all the people who just walk around in our parishes and just how they think, and then it informs us as to what kind of ministries we can do going forward. And that's it.
Thank you, Johan. One thing I would just add too is that nothing beats anecdotal evidence in my view too. This is the kind of information you can get from an embryonics report. But, you know, speaking to people about what their needs are, which was so good about opening that food pantry, for example, or speaking to people who are in our community, has given us so much information, like the need for fresh fruit and vegetables. Like there are people who just are not getting enough vitamin C from a natural source in their diet. And so that was like, okay, well maybe we can develop a partnership with a local store that can drop off some oranges on Monday morning. A local bakery we were able to pitch in. Starbucks of all places offered to have a container for us, and so we put a kind of a nice sign on this basket in Starbucks, and it was kind of a nice thing, you know, for them to do that too. So as Johan said, that embryonics research is helpful along with the evidence that you get from listening to people who you meet in the parish.
Thank you both. Very good. Maggie, over to you, and what I think is a very different demographic.
Very, very, very different. I've actually been doing some demographic and experiential analysis of our neighborhood, which I live in and have lived in for most of my adult life. So I'm from the hood. St. Stephen's actually has one of the geographically smallest parishes in the diocese, I think. But it is complex, dense, extremely multi-ethnic, extremely poor. People don't understand how poor the Kensington Chinatown neighborhood is because it's surrounded by the annex, where there's a lot of affluence. College Street is a powerful demographic dividing line. The neighborhood we serve is one of the poorest in Toronto. It's also made up of a huge number of single adults, many of them living in non-family shared accommodation. The people who are employed are mostly working in the service industry. People go to Kensington to party. People who live in Kensington are not necessarily partying. I mean, it's a fascinating neighborhood. It is highly educated. Many of the people working in the service industry are also artists or cultural producers of various kinds. It's a neighborhood with a powerful sense of identity, as is Chinatown. It is a very poor, very vulnerable neighborhood, and has been for a long time. Neighborhood as parish is not a new idea at St. Stephen's. I had the good fortune to come into a parish which had been shaped by previous incumbents. And I would mention especially the Reverend Campbell Russell, who was there in the 80s, who wrote extensively and put in practice extensively the idea of the parish church. It's not there to be a place for Anglicans. It is there to be a resource for anyone in the community to come to for whatever they need. And that is what he made it, and that is what it has continued to be. What people need has changed over the years, but the church has always been a church of extremely porous boundaries, of an extremely wide range of uses, and a church which is very open to the community coming in and reshaping what the church is and what it does. Among the results of that have been the founding of St. Stephen's Community House, which has now become the Neighbourhood Group and is a massive citywide multi-service agency now, although it continues to operate 3 different venues within Kensington Market. And the Stop Community Food Centre was actually founded from St. Stephen's. It was originally called Stop 103 for 103 Bellevue. So there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of sense of, once I was sitting in my office and a father and his son walked in, because we just keep our doors open as much as we can. There weren't people who attended services, but the little boy said, "Dad, is this our church?" And the father said, "Well, it's the church of the market, so yes, it is our church." And that has always been, when people in the market, when people in Kensington Market say the church, they mean St. Stephen in the Fields. They don't mean the Lutheran Church, they don't mean the United Church. There are other churches in the neighborhood, but the church is St. Stephen in the Fields. And people have a strong sense of it as their church, even if they are not Anglicans, even if they are not Christians, even if they would never attend a worship service. Or they might attend a worship service even though they're not Christians because it's the community. The services, and again, this is something that I was lucky enough to walk into. It's something that matches very much with my own thinking, but not something that I created on my own. The services really are more genuinely inclusive than anything I've ever seen. Anyone can walk in, and anyone does walk in, including people having psychotic episodes, including people who are drunk, including people who are high, and including people who are, making a pile of money off investments and feeling some kind of emptiness in their lives. Once Doug Ford's car drove past and a member of the congregation ran out and chased his car for about 6 blocks trying to get hold of him and bring him back to get him into church. We've talked ever since then about what would we have done if we'd actually got Doug Ford into our church. But that kind of absolute openness and acceptance within the congregation has been a hallmark for a long time. We have, and I think we're well known for having a very active, what is called outreach program. We have a Friday night meal and drop-in, and Saturday and Sunday morning breakfasts. We get over 100 people at each of these every week. The majority of people who come to the drop-in would probably be described as street homeless. The majority of people who come to the breakfast are actually seniors in nearby community housing, although some people who are street homeless come as well, and then a whole variety of other people. Part of the idea of the drop-in in particular is you don't need to be poor to come. Anybody can come. You can come in, university students wander in, people wander in. It's a very open environment. I've been very influenced by Rowan Williams' writings about vulnerable space. And we have, if we are in any way healthy, a community of people which is not subject to economics. We are one of the few institutions actually perfectly positioned to resist capitalism. We are perfectly positioned to be the counterweight to the current situation in which the economy is devouring people alive, which has accelerated during COVID tremendously, and has accelerated even more since capitalism decided that the pandemic should be over now. People are being consumed by the economy in a way that we have not seen for a long time, and the church is one of the best potential areas of resistance because we, at our best, are not an economic space. And I think that's really important. And I think our space, our physical space, is very important to understand. I think in different contexts, how we employ that physical space is going to be very different. I think Jason and I, in different contexts and with different physical plans, are doing very different things about our physical space, but both coming out of that understanding that our physical space needs to be put to the use of the community in the best way possible. This can be dangerous. It can be strange. It can be in vulnerable space, being truly vulnerable space, as Rowan Williams has written about it. I can tell you, I have been trying to do it for 10 years now, and it is exhausting. It pushes you in all kinds of directions that are very, very tiring to go in. When COVID first hit, the church as worship space was closed. The diocese closed all churches as worship spaces. Our drop-in continued to operate. We continued to operate without a break. We never missed a week, nor did we miss a week at the breakfast. At one point, we were one of 5 drop-ins continuing to operate inside in the entire city of Toronto. All Saints Sherbourne was another. St. Stephen's Community House was another. So 3 of the 5 were in some way Anglican or Anglican founded spaces. We have never missed a week. So we continued to be in the church. We continued to have our community, which includes people making food and people eating food, and as far as possible, not too much hierarchy there. We continued to be in the church without a break. Worship services have been online successfully. We have brought back some in-person worship successfully, but maintaining that space when very little space was available. The first night after the big shutdown, the first night we opened, one of our guests actually ripped our door off about half an hour before we opened. He was so desperate for some place he could be inside. Someone else came in weeping and said, "This is the first time in 3 days I've been able to sit down." People were coming in talking about how they were sleeping on the TTC because there was literally no other space available to them. So that we had space and that space was open to people was so important. And it wasn't easy to do, and it was dangerous. And we didn't even have masks. We had one box of masks that I spent like $60 for at a pharmacy. But we did it, and I'm very, very proud of all my people that we did it. What's happening right now, which is the biggest part of our church life, is that I think many of you are probably aware that the City of Toronto is in a housing crisis and also an emergency shelter crisis. You might have seen some of the statistics that have come out, which were during September. This is before any cold weather. During September, over 5,000 people attempted to find a shelter bed in Toronto and were turned away. The encampments have been violently cleared from public parks, and anytime a tent goes up in a public park now, it is removed extremely rapidly by the police. So we have an encampment in our churchyard. We didn't ask for that to happen. We didn't invite for that to happen, but people had a need, and people knew that this space was a space which would not turn them away. And we have, it's growing all the time. The tents are packed like this now because there's nowhere else for people to go. They've filled the Bellevue yard, they've filled the back side of the church. They're starting to set tents up along College Street now because there's nowhere else. There's nothing. We had a city worker in a few days ago saying like, "Oh, I found people who want to go inside." And we're like, they all want to go inside. She said, "I'm just going to phone to see what beds are available." We said, "Yeah, let us know how you go with that." And about half an hour later, she came back and she's like, "Yeah, there are no beds available." So not all the neighbors are happy. We get a lot of hate mail. And there are difficulties. People living 2 inches away from each other is hard. People argue, people's needs come into conflict. It's inevitable with human beings packed that tight together. Garbage is very hard to handle. No one wants to live outside. It's getting colder. It's horrible. The worst thing is every single day being made aware multiple times a day that there are human beings having to sleep in these packed tight tents in a churchyard in the cold because there is nowhere else they can go. And having to be aware of that multiple times every day breaks your heart. The city has recently informed us that the churchyard is not our property. It is apparently a transportation right-of-way. So the city may indeed have the legal ability to violently clear people from the churchyard. We don't know how that's going to play out. I think they hoped that when they presented that information to us, they would say, "Oh my goodness, well certainly they will have to leave then." I think you will all agree that it is morally and ethically the churchyard, even if it is a transportation right-of-way. So we are prepared to hold on to it as the last safe place for as long as we can, but we don't know what's going to happen with that. So yeah, being vulnerable space isn't easy. But to be vulnerable, to be undefended, is what Christ models for us. And we are trying as best we can to live that out in our complex, fascinating, afflicted neighborhood. And that's probably enough for me for now.
Thank you.
So, left to my own devices, I get theoretical, so mine will be slightly more theoretical than the others, although there'll be some storytelling involved. So I've actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about this topic of parish ministry as neighborhood ministry. In fact, I used to run a workshop on this theme with Judy Paulson over at the Institute of Evangelism. But it's been 3+ years since I've done that. And as I came back to this, I came back to my slide deck and my thinking about this, and a lot has changed. So a lot has changed in the world, a lot has changed about my own thinking. So that's going to become apparent as I go through what I have to offer today, and I really look forward to the conversation to aid in my own thinking about where we are as a church and how it is that we contribute to the well-being of our communities. So the first question to begin with, again, I'm getting theoretical, is what is a parish? And I'll give you the definition that we use in the Diocese of Toronto according to Canon 1, Definitions and Procedures. A parish is defined, it's a defined area in the diocese. Really, that's the important part. A defined area in the diocese that has been set apart by the bishop in accordance with the canon on parishes having within it one or more congregation under one incumbent, one at least of which has a regularly organized vestry, and on and on. This canon on parishes that it refers to is just basically a set of procedures for how do you start, amalgamate, or end a parish. So again, that main point is in that first line. A parish is a geographical area and not a congregation. So in the Anglican model, the parish is the ministry context of the congregation and not the congregation itself. So it's the role of the congregation to serve the parish under the leadership of the bishop through his or her designated clergy in that space. So why parish ministry? The concept of yeast, or the image of yeast, is an ambiguous one in the New Testament, but in at least one place Jesus uses that image to talk about the kingdom of God. And Andrew Rumsey, was a priest when he wrote the book, now a bishop in the Church of England, in his book called Parish and Anglican Theology of Place, helpfully uses this image of yeast. And I think Chris had you read that book for the mission class. So it helps to think about the potential impact and the limits of parish ministry. So this is what he says. The church is primarily concerned not with the world becoming the church, but with the world finding its true place by virtue of the church's action and presence. The church has no need to extend its own territory into the world. Rather, as yeast working through a batch of dough, it seeks to effect the transformation of the whole. And here's the important part, not plainly that the batch should all become yeast. It is in this parochial ecclesiology where the local congregation is a transforming agent, a means and not an end, the nature and condition of society is of greatest interest. So when I would run this workshop, I would often bring with me a sourdough starter. I don't know if anybody else bakes sourdough, but it's the same. It's made up of the same thing that the loaf is made up of, which is to say water, flour, and some naturally occurring bacteria. But if you ever tried to bake a sourdough starter into a loaf, you would get a pancake. You wouldn't get a loaf. That's because the starter does its best work when it is a minority presence within the larger batch. And so I do think there is something about that image which is quite helpful, and Rumsey brings that out. So a bit of a story of Epiphany St. Parkdale, where I'm at. I've been there for over a decade now, but only for the last couple of years in the role of the incumbent. But to tell you a little bit about Epiphany St. Mark, it began as St. Mark's, as the first house of worship to be established in the village of Parkdale in 1877. Anglican worship has continued on that site almost uninterrupted since then. It is the original home of the Parkdale branch of the Toronto Public Library. It started in that little schoolhouse just next to the church. And it's been an incubator space for lots of other community organizations since that time. And since the 1960s, in particular with immigration from the Caribbean, it has been an intentionally welcoming place for Afro-Caribbean Anglicans. And the next slide, it has a strong social justice legacy. Often that's pointed back to the Reverend Canon Graham Cotter, who was also one who initiated that intentional welcome as somebody, a white man but grew up in Jamaica, was very conscious about the welcome to to the folks from the Caribbean who were moving into the neighborhood of Parkdale. His late wife Evelyn was active in local and provincial politics. There have been some challenging years, and I could read through that list, but anybody who is at a parish will be familiar with the challenges that I'm talking about in terms of decline, decreasing revenues, deferred maintenance, limited imagination, and disconnection from the neighborhood are some of these things that plague many of our places. But in recent years, a new vision and an old DNA have helped to re-embed the church in the community. And by this new vision, I mean this understanding specifically of the parish as the neighborhood. So the congregation now finds itself value aligned with some key neighborhood partners. The congregation is recognized as a community partner, and the building is recognized as a community asset. And this will be familiar from what we've heard about St. Stephen in the Fields as well. The building continues to house a worshiping community, a small one, but a faithful worshiping community, but it is also an active community hub. And that community hub is teeming with what we used to call tenants or licensees, but now we call community partners. So understanding the neighborhood as the parish and seeking its well-being has in fact led to renewal at Epiphany and St. Mark Parkdale. And there's potential for even more impact in terms of neighborhood well-being. There's affordable housing is the one that I'm really trying to pursue at this point, along with the possibility of expanding food security, popular education, youth literacy, more community event space, interfaith engagement, and much, much more. But here's where I've done a little bit of returning to this after some time has caused me to do a little bit of rethinking. There is a structural problem. That problem is that the parish model is not viable. I'm open to some conversation about this, but this is something that I'm putting on the table. That the success of the parish model has always depended upon the conditions of Christendom. And ever since that artificial lifeline has been cut off, decay has been setting in. So our situation is no longer one of widespread nominal Christianity. Capitalism has long since uprooted people from their vital connection to specific parochial geographies and formed them into consumers. Acts of mercy, charity, service, and hospitality that defined the early church have long since been taken over by professional charities. And the fastest growing religion, quote unquote, is non-religion. So under these post-Christendom conditions, the parish model faces a crisis of survival. So the question for me is less how do we understand the neighborhood as parish, but how do we understand the possibility of a parish in the first place? So what do we do? And I'm going to conclude with a proposal, one that sees not the parish, but the diaconia, which is to say the decentralized, lay-led, home-based Christian gathering as the basic unit of the church. But I'm going to do this not with my own words, but with those of Ivan Illich, who proposed this model half a century ago, while he was still serving as a Roman Catholic priest. And interestingly, Disertot is sort of in that similar line to Illich, somebody who was deeply formed in the church, left active ministry or active engagement with the church, but continued to exercise, I think, a very interesting theological and priestly vocation in the places they went. So, in any case, interesting you brought up Disertot. So I offer this as a proposal and not as a solution. I very much value your feedback on it. So this is Illich's thumbnail sketch of the Church of the Future, and I'm gonna quote him, changing some of his language to be more inclusive. An adult layperson ordained to the ministry will preside over the normal Christian community of the future. This ministry will be an exercise of leisure rather than a job. The diaconia will supplant the parish as the fundamental institutional unit in the church. The periodic meeting of friends will replace the Sunday assembly of strangers. A self-supporting dentist, factory worker, professor, rather than a church-employed scribe or functionary, will preside over the meeting. The minister will be a person mature in Christian wisdom through their lifelong participation in an intimate liturgy, rather than a seminary graduate formed professionally through theological formulae. I foresee the face-to-face meeting of families around a table, rather than the impersonal attendance of a crowd around an altar. Celebration will sanctify the dining room, rather than consecrated buildings, the ceremony. The ordinary future priest, earning their living outside the church, will preside over a weekly meeting of a dozen deacons in their house. Together they will read the scripture, then study and comment upon the bishop's weekly instruction. After the meeting, when it includes a mass, each deacon will take the sacrament to their own home, where they will keep it with their crucifix and Bible. The priest will visit their various diaconias and preside at their occasional mass. At times, a number of the diaconias will meet for a more solemn mass in a rented hall or in a cathedral. So I leave you with Illich's words as a provocation in some ways, but really an opening for conversation. Mostly so that you can help me think through this, because I think this is something the church needs to figure out.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm opening up for discussion now. I think there's a lot of really rich resonance between the different presentations that we've heard. This is at the beginning. My own framing of this is about how we can be getting back to what the church was meant to be doing all along anyway. And I've heard a lot of that in each of our presentations so far. But obviously there's diversity in the neighborhoods that are in play here, but the way that the church has to work with those neighborhoods, I think, is a kind of commonality across there. But we'll open things up to just questions from those gathered here today, and we'll get a bit of discussion going, or also you guys can respond to one another. And I know you've specifically asked for a response about some of your thinking, and there's even more on your Facebook page for those who want to be stimulated. So anyway, are there any questions that come to mind from those gathered here?
My background is as a Ukrainian Orthodox priest who has always served in ethnic parishes, lots of immigrants, etc. And on the one hand, I would really tend to agree with you that the institutional parish is not a viable paradigm. What we see where you have a critical mass of immigrants from here or there who are sometimes able to maintain themselves generationally, you can have that institutional parish, but it's really in general not a terribly viable model. I love Yiddish, but I would ask, and by the way, thanks to the others of you for your presentations. I found a lot of resonances between what you are talking about and what I, on a much smaller scale, have found to be effective in integrating, this parish that 15 years ago didn't speak English, into the general society, and it really does bring benefits to the parish itself. But to come back to the issue of the institutional parish as opposed to no parish, I'm wondering if there isn't maybe a place that's in between, probably closer to what Yiddish says, but not going that far. That's sort of where I am in this whole thing.
Yeah, could I jump in? I think Illich is talking about two different things there, and it may be that we need to disentangle the two. The end of the priesthood as professional class, as professional caste, yeah, I think that is almost inevitable. Do we actually want to surrender our physical space to capitalism? No, this is what I say too. And Illich seems to be taking for granted that the physical space is surrendered. So I can go with him on eliminating the priesthood as professional class. I think we need to do a lot more thinking about the physical space and the use of the physical space and the subversive use of the physical space.
And is there a kind of nodal element to this as well? Because, and maybe to Father Bogdan's point, I mean, Jason, you and I have talked before about, this sort of thinking around sacramentality of the world and so forth, and the various kind of nodes that has, right? But for those of us who are Anglican or Orthodox or take sacrament seriously, the Eucharist at the heart of all of that. And I think Illich's model is trying to get at that, but maybe in a peculiarly Roman Catholic model from the 1960s or something. But is there a way in which there's still that space where maybe the few, maybe sometimes more, that gather and are, filled with the presence of God through that, but are operating then in those other places that ought to be seen equally sacramental, right? That's the key, that when that meal takes place in the family home, or when the community that's grown things together in their community garden, and they get together and they share even recipes and even how to cook, because that's a real struggle these days. I look at what some people who are maybe at the lower income level of the spectrum, what they're putting in their shopping carts is processed food aplenty sometimes.
It's not because they don't know how to cook, it's because processed food is cheaper.
Is cheaper, okay. Well, but we should be doing everything we can to equip people with the best of everything, food and recipes and companionship as they do that. But to see that as another node of precisely the sacramentality of the altar in that gathered space, right? And I think Illich is probably still trying to hang on to that somehow, but the language is maybe different from what you're doing in Parkdale, what you're doing at St. Stephen's, what you're doing at St. John's. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, just to go back, because Illich wrote about a lot of stuff, right? And I would really support what you say about the, not giving the space over to the capitalism, right? I would push back a little bit though on the professionality, because he also writes, for example, that like deschooling society, or I think that's the title, where you're gonna deinstitutionalize education. He talks the same thing about medicine. Now, I don't know how comfortable I am about having some guy who's trained as a bricklayer deal with my appendicitis. So I think that's sort of where I am in all of this. And so as I say, my personal, if this is the diapason, the range, I'm leaning probably about 2/3 towards what you're talking about on both counts.
Yeah, I mean,
Jason, if I can just say one thing in response to your question too. I don't think any of this is new, from what I can tell from IMHO, as my kids would say. I mean, the return to an Acts 2 church, where it's the tenement churches and the home churches. That was an interesting observation that we made during COVID, is that the dispersed church was driven back into the homes. And now we're trying to continue that kind of thing on. That is really where I know you're speaking about your author's speaking about something a little bit different, but I don't think it's that different, and I don't think it's that new either. And I think the quote that you read from Sam Wells about we have a new humility as the church is absolutely right. There is no room for grandiose processionals anymore, a la Constantinople, you know what I mean? Like, I think that we are in a place, I hope, of greater humility. And I think, just one final comment from me on land use. I think I'm with Maggie on the sacred space and the space where people feel free of economics when they enter into these spaces is absolutely right. We have a lot of rectory land, that can be reimagined. That's something we're doing in our context, which is sitting like buried talents while people are setting up tents in churchyards.
yeah, I mean, I should point out that part of my thinking about physical space is coming out of a parish which has geographically a tiny footprint. We're little. We're a little building, and we have a worship space and a multi-use space, both of which are small, and we have, a tiny strip of land on each side and a very slightly larger yard on Bellevue. And so, my thinking about physical space is coming out of a parish whose physical footprint is actually minuscule. I think, especially, we make a lot of good use of it, I think. But yeah, we do not, if you're in a parish that has that big expanse of land, that large physical plant, the thinking obviously is very different. It has to be.
But I don't think you don't wanna relinquish the space that you have that
Yeah.
you're using for these holy purposes, and I think, anyway, that would just be my.
Can I offer two things?
Yeah, I was also gonna say it would be good to, because we went through some slides pretty quickly there showing what's happening in Parkdale, but maybe people don't even know what you meant when you were talking about tenants becoming, you know, community partners and something like that. But
Yeah,
sure.
Maybe you can go back to that slide. Well, so two things in response. So one about land and buildings, and one about tables. So Jeffrey was getting at exactly where my thinking has been going on this. And it's not a question of doing away with the parish model and starting something new. Like I used the word decay. Like I think we're in this process of the decay of that system. I think we need to let that decay run its course, but be planning ahead for what's coming next. And I think this proliferation of tables for me, and it's the Orthodox notion of sacramentality that's helping me to think about that. And so I've just taken a couple of weeks study break to do some writing about this. But I also began a practice with my family at home of gathering people around our dinner table, and so the one that we just had we would call a sacred dinner party. We could also, with another group of people, have an agape meal, some scaled down version of what we would do at the altar in the church. Or we could also have a mixed group of people with a little bit of intentionality around a regular dinner party, and that could be a sacred dinner party without the Christian language, but somehow to re-sacralize not only the dinner table in the home, but the seminar table and all the tables that we're at. I think that's what I'm most interested in, and not doing away with the altar. The altar, and Illich's thing about there is that maybe these occasional gatherings at the cathedral. He's assuming the cathedral's going to stay. I'm assuming our cathedral's going to stay. I'm assuming a bunch of other parishes are going to stay too, and they can be these sites where I talk about the sacramental intensity is greatest at those sites, which isn't to say the other tables aren't sacramental, and I think we need to rediscover the sacramentality of those other tables. But then just briefly on the land, I think that the land and building question, and that's my other sort of passion. I've offered to the diocese a theological basis for thinking about what they're going to do with all that land, and I think that we need to be proactive in our thinking about it. We need to offer just a slight conceptual distinction. Maggie, you spoke about the church being public space. I think that the church is common space. If we think about public as having to do with, has connected to the state somehow, the state is managing that space and offering access to it. I know what you meant, but
I'm using Rowan Williams' terminology, and he uses public.
Yeah,
Why I use public.
fair enough. But I think if we open up that common space, and I think that, and there are going to be no less than 4 motions coming to synod in a couple of weeks about housing and land for good reason. That as we think about this, it's absolutely, you're right, not handing it over to capitalism. And I think if we don't think about what we're going to do with it, that's what's going to happen by default.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I think we need to prioritize the transfer of that land to organizations or groups who are going to be able to maintain the common access that exists there, whether that's to other religious organizations or to not-for-profit land trust or whatever it is.
Or whether we can do it ourselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can do it ourselves.
For sure, and wherever we can, we should. But we have to be able to realize when we aren't going to be able to do it, so we don't get to the crisis situation, developer swoops in. And,
yes, absolutely.
And I know that there's not, churches don't in principle have a problem with selling off to developers, especially because they can offer millions of dollars to build a new sanctuary or something like that. So I think we really need some thinking about that.
Yeah, but so sometimes we can do it ourselves.
Absolutely.
One more comment about land. We actually did not begin this with a land acknowledgement, and I meant to address that before I spoke, and I didn't, so also my omission. All the land that we have, we stole. We straight up stole it. I mean, that is now a reality. It is a well-established reality, but it is something we cannot forget. We stole all our land. And what that means is that if we are not using our land in accordance in this particular area with the dish with one spoon wampum and the 2 row wampum. If we are not using our land in a way that is aligned with those wampum belt covenants, we should give it back. Whether that means the actual land, whether it means the resources, whatever it means, we stole it. And if we're not using it under the terms of the wampum belt covenants which govern this territory, we should return it.
Hear, hear.
But hopefully some of these things are.
Yes, oh yes,
Okay.
yes, I believe that, absolutely, yeah, but I think that's not a bad framework for us to hold in our minds as guidance as to what use should we be making of the land we have? Is it in alignment with the wampum belt covenants which govern this territory?
And just briefly on that, so, and I think in the church in particular, we have an opportunity to, yes, certainly abide by those covenants that our predecessors signed us on for, but also realize within our own tradition, we have ways that we can think about land in similar ways.
Mm-hmm.
So just a brief anecdote, I was at it was a community consultation for a new affordable housing development. Land happened to be owned by a church. And an indigenous woman came onto the call and said, you know, this is great, but you could just give the land to us, and we could do it. And a bit of laughter, and anyway, that didn't go through. But what struck me was that it took a community consultation facilitated by a development firm, a for-profit development firm, who's building affordable housing, which is great, but it took that to facilitate the connection between the indigenous community and the church to talk about land. And what we need to do is get around that capitalist mediation of our relation to land and say that in the church we have ways of thinking about land that will put us in alignment with the dish with one spoon covenant without needing the state or a developer to make us think about it.
Let me confess that I married a parishioner of St. Mark's Parkdale. I stole her. And Dr. Graham Cotter married us in the chapel just 100 feet that way. I don't know that I'm going to be able to be a synod because I will be out of town. But I reflect that the parish I now belong to, the corner of Bloor and Avenue Road, has a member called Marg Creel. She's a lawyer, and she's going to become the chancellor of the diocese on January 1st. My question is, and this refers to St. Stephen's, can we get the diocese, the bishop, the chancellor, so on, to guard us against any depredations by the state for what little land we may have, which we are putting to righteous use now. I think the diocese, if the state, the city, the province, whatever, indicates that it's going to impinge upon us, we shouldn't just lie back and say, okay, walk over us. No, I think we should put up one heck of a fight because of, what's it called? The halo effect. Oh yes. Anybody heard of that?
Yes,
the halo effect.
Project, yes.
What St. Stephen's is doing is part of the halo effect. But I just don't want us to be steamrolled because of, well, the C word, capitalism. I don't care what word you use. But I think that we have to take our stand like Martin Luther long ago.
Yeah, I will say the bishop and all the diocesan staff have been extremely supportive.
Good.
And they've gotten a lot of hate mail, like a lot of hate mail, mostly from 2 or 3 people, but a lot of letters from those few people.
It's a good sign you're doing something right.
But
And
it also-
they have
yeah.
been very, very supportive. What happens if the city attempts to evict? I don't know. I can tell you that it is going to happen over the objection of a lot of people in the community and over the gathered presence of a lot of people in the community.
But this all speaks to the complexity of neighborhoods, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's not just a matter of saying, oh, look how easy it is, church can engage, can do all these marvelous things, can do surveys and find out exactly who it is, but I mean, these are human beings with
Yeah.
human conflicts and human, you
Yeah,
know.
and I do think it is part of the legacy of St. Stephen's, which I didn't create, which means that the community comes to us.
Hmm.
We actually have very little need to go out and try to find out what the community needs, because the community comes to St. Stephen's and says, here is what we need.
Yeah.
You're
And
very,
right now-
Maggie, you're fortunate in that,
Yes, I
because
am.
your church has been porous.
Yes,
Our church has not.
I know, we've been very.
And that's
I mean,
because-
Cemetery chapel.
Yeah, cemetery chapel
Yeah.
and closed doors,
Yeah.
and, you
Well,
know,
I've been
nobody
very lucky.
home.
I've been very lucky.
So,
The
so
history of that
recognizing
parish
the
is-
different context you land
Absolutely,
in,
absolutely.
and that we
yes.
stand on the shoulders of those who go before us, for sure.
Absolutely.
But there
No,
are
I-
a lot
I-
more like St. John's
There's
Norway started off than this.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
as you say, like your whole neighborhood, you're known as the community church
Yeah.
for a lot of hard work over a lot.
Many generations.
Yeah.
Getting back briefly to the encampment, we will defend the encampment if we have to. But it needs to be very clear, we're not doing this because we think it's good for people to be living in tents in a church.
No, no.
I think we
Right.
all know.
Nobody wants to have a
People
food
need
pantry
housing.
either, like.
You know, if people need housing, we want these people to have some acceptable place to go indoors. But if all that they have, if literally all that they have is a tent in a churchyard, we're gonna at least fight to let them keep that.
I don't agree completely with you, but this is a much larger issue
Yes.
than St. Stephen's or the Diocese of Toronto.
Oh, yes.
I'm just wondering if there others should be involved in this fight, because this sets a precedent for, takeover for pretty much any house of worship. Does it not? I mean, not the house, but your surroundings.
I mean, officially, legally, it is a transportation right of way. Many people don't realize that they probably don't own their own front yard. It's probably a transportation right of way.
But I
And
think
can be
that-
seized by the city at any moment.
Yeah,
So that's,
but I think others need to know.
City's
that.
not gonna do it though.
they might, I mean, if they wanted to build
The
something,
councillors
they
would have a fit
Yeah.
if people, ordinary, bourgeois people, found out that their front yards were going to be taken away from them.
They do it to poor people though, in a
Well, they would,
heartbeat.
of course they would.
Well, that's just it. Paige.
I mean, it's interesting, so I don't think of it as decay, as deconstruction. Because we have to your point, we have to be intentional and thoughtful about what's next. Decay is just you really have no control over decay, right? Once it starts, it keeps going. Whereas if we're thoughtful around how we deconstruct our understanding around parish, then we can be listening in a different way and respond in a different way rather than be reactionary. And so I don't think of it as land or as space, but as place, which is inherently relational, right? Which is what we're all talking about. So I marry an urban planning background with theology. So I take both of those things and kind of throw them around in a pot and add things into it. And what sits to me is it's not about the land. It's not about the people. It's about the ontological reality that where we are is highly relational. And it includes the land, it includes the building, it includes all of these activities within the neighborhood. And I think the church is stuck in an understanding of neighbors' needs, right? Rather than understanding who we are and our relationships with each other, right? So, and the context matters in this case, right? So Maggie, by all rights, needs to focus on the needs that are being presented to her in her neighborhood, right? But I think often enough, the parish I'm working in right now, who needs our help? I love that, but I hate it at the same time because I think it misses the point. It's not about what we're gonna do for each other or for others because we're called to be neighbors, but it's about living in the reality that we're already in relationship. And so how do we live within that relationship with each other? And the churches are that agent where we're nourished to do that work, right? To be able to be present, as opposed to a current model where we're just doing things for others and trying to maintain a building, and we think that the building is what makes the liturgy sacred, as opposed to the inherent sacredness of the act of the table, right? So, I'm delighted that I hadn't thought about Illich in a long time, but his notion around that, right? That the sacramentality in other places reminds us of the sacramentality of relationship. And that happens outside the church. If it's only happening in the church, we've got it wrong.
I think that's a good place to start. I mean, yeah, wonderful page, and echoes too of Samuel's there with the not working for, but the being with, right? So.
Could I
we
tell
started
one
with it.
little
But yeah,
anecdote?
absolutely, please, take us on.
I think most people know we have a Timothy Schmaltz Panhandler Jesus statue outside our church. One of my favorite little tiny anecdotes from my time is years ago, a friend of mine, an indigenous guy named Winter, came in with a friend of his, and he said, you know, hey, Mother Maggie, this is my friend X. I think she needs to talk to you about some stuff, so she's going to sit down and talk to you. I'll be outside with Jesus. That's a good phrase to hang on to.
Yeah, it is.
Outside with you. Thank you. Well, thank you all for what I think was a really stimulating conversation. Hopefully those who will be joining us by watching it online will further this discussion and take this forward in all of the different contexts, right? Because I think that's what's really come through for me today, is that this level and type of conversation has to take place everywhere, in all the places that the page refers to, in all the relationships that we have, and it's vital that we carry that forward. So I thank you all for your ministry that you do, because as I said at the beginning, it's a real inspiration to me what you're all up to, and we're going to carry forward these thoughts here at Trinity and with all the people that we meet. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.